Hello, Internet, and welcome to the 52nd episode of the Deep Fried Neurons podcast. And I have to apologize in advance because there's a lot of noise in the recording, mostly because, well, I'm not doing it in the comfort of my home anymore. The mics are a lot more deliberate, so, that helps, because I got a new mic, it really changed how we experience the audio recordings. But overall, there's a lot of noise is all. I couldn't remove all of it, but it was a good episode and I really wanted to share it, so I'm just gonna cue the fucking What's up, boomers? Hello, welcome to the 52nd episode of the Deep Fried Neurons podcast, and today we have two guests with us. I would rather have them introduce themselves because I always fuck up introductions and it's a nightmare of mine. So
Hi, I'm Aditi.
Hi, I'm Trishla.
when I say introduce yourself, I mean more than that. Tell us what you do, tell us what your educational background is and things like that. Brilliant start. I love it. This is so awkward. My audience is gonna love you guys.
Okay, so I'm Aditi. I am an architect and a art historian-ish. And I work with Tifa Working Studios. I do programs and curation and design and stuff like that. Yeah.
I'm Trishla Talera. I am founder, director of Tifa Working Studios, as fancy as that sounds. I studied fine art, specifically textiles and fibers, and other kinds of fine art.
Okay. Well, as it stands in front of this podcast, the issue today that we're discussing is conceptual art. And if any of you people who call me a snob on the street, you can quit right now. Actually, don't. I need the listens and the watch time, please. But today, I don't know a lot about conceptual art, but these people do, which is why I'm here trying to gather their opinion and run with as much knowledge as I can home. So what I read about conceptual art on the internet is that the idea of art matters more than, well, literally anything. That could be skill, the aesthetic, all of it is secondary. And the concept is that the idea matters is all. Well, that was very, very vague for me. And the other thing I read was that most of the people who are famous for doing conceptual art got famous in 1960s. You can go literally in any direction. Oh, another piece of information that I had is Sol LeWitt is the father of conceptual art for most people.
Marcel Duchamp.
I know Marcel Duchamp has been mentioned on the podcast before, which again is a point of differentiation.
He's the father. So Marcel Duchamp is considered the father of conceptual art. A lot of people do think that Sol LeWitt deserves the title. I personally like Sol LeWitt a lot more because I think he pushed it a lot further. But Marcel did kind of begin the movement, fathering definitely Sol.
He didn't nurture it. Sol LeWitt nurtured the movement much more than Duchamp ever did.
So is it safe to assume that the biological dad is Marcel Duchamp and the dad who adopted and raised the kid is Sol LeWitt?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I find it very amusing how you say you find conceptual art vague, because it's really the basis of meme culture today. Absurdity, Dadaism, conceptual art, these are kind of the baseline for what we're seeing on the internet today in a lot of ways.
The reason I say it's vague is because I don't know where the scope of conceptual art stops and the rest of the art begins.
Nor do we.
We are going to find
Nor do we. And before this podcast, we were talking about what we would do on this podcast, and we started debating even before that. So I don't think there is a line to segregate. It kind of overlaps in very many ways.
So, my audience knows a little bit about Marcel Duchamp. In that sense, they know about two artifacts that he put in the museum. First one, of course, is the fountain, where he put literally a toilet. in there, and the second one, I'm sorry? Urinal. And the other one is, I think the bottle hanger or the coat hanger. The coat hanger. Those are the two that they know about or have mentioned before. For our new audience, they probably have no clue. So could you give your understanding of conceptual art and as to what it means according to you? We'll do like turn by turn.
So I won't say much about Marcel, but just to kind of preface this, he started a movement called the Ready-Mates, which was pretty much in the early 60s, where industrial revolution was just hitting, and he was kind of, this is where also design kind of gets introduced into art, and the differentiation between art and design kind of starts to blur. So he put a urinal, which was an industrial made object, onto a pedestal in a museum and called it art. So a lot of questions around, is this art? Who gets to call it art? So really the foundation of where conceptual art lies is within the question. I think for me, obviously these are the starting, but also what Sol LeWitt brings into the view is, does an artist need to make their own artwork? And this is where it starts to get shaky. And also, Aditi was mentioning earlier, skill. How much skill does an artist need to have to be an artist? And this is where conceptual art kind of changed the rules as to who can apply, who can use these terminologies into what they do. Do I need to know how to draw or sculpt to be an artist? And today the answer is no. But in the 60s it was very much yes. So they were very, very rebellious for their time. They were very, very progressive in kind of being like, you know what, we're going to break all standards or assumptions or boxes that you think art can exist in, and kind of see where we can push art until.
Again, I feel like I don't want to talk about this historically. I want to talk about it more conceptually. Sorry. But like, mostly because I feel like the idea of conceptual art is to break down the difference between art, design, craft, and where each of them lie, because this has been these three things, and the subject of art versus design versus craft has been of debate since centuries. And when you go about and say that, sorry, I can't pick up a paintbrush, or I can't sculpt, or I can't do whatever, and I'm going to make something that is not even objectively pretty, you know, how is what I make art? Is what conceptual art essentially addressed. And more than that, I feel like, I was talking to Trishla about this earlier, I feel like it's a subset of a lot of things that happen in the arts, design, cultural sector in general right now. Like where we are right now, we owe it to conceptual art. Meme culture, for example, a lot of aesthetics in the internet culture is because of the idea of conceptual art, because we are constantly questioning what is beautiful. What your idea of beautiful is different from my idea of beautiful, and that is something that conceptual art gave us. There's not one version of aesthetic, there's not one version of beauty, and there is not one version of skill.
I find that really interesting because it's this time in the 60s where we've gone through the Renaissance, where we've gone through seeing these really elaborate paintings, elaborate sculptures, you've seen really ornate things. So when Surrealism started, when Dadaism started, it was really with this idea of how do we go forward from here? How do we negate? How do we come back to basics? So abstracting and the idea of abstraction started 20s onwards, I would say, but in conceptual art is really where it peaked, because they took out so much meaning from the visual, because most of the art culture that we talk about is predominantly a visual culture. They removed so many visual elements, they removed so much of the aesthetic of it, that it was really to come to the very basics of how can I say what I want to say without really showing anything, which is where conceptual art started to sit. We're saying something, but we're giving you literally like one or two hints of what it could be. The rest is for you to figure out.
It's kind of like I'm thinking something, and what I'm thinking is in this space where hundreds of people can access it, and each of them can access it differently. So I have this thought can be represented in any way possible. This thought can be someone screaming. This thought can be like a line on a piece of paper. This thought can be an empty room. But what you bring, like what you take home of that thought is up to you. And which is why I feel like audiences struggle a lot with conceptual art because they don't know what to take home with them when it is something as raw as like an empty room or someone screaming. What do you take home from that? So yeah, I agree with you in that sense that, you know, it's kind of like abstraction to a point where you don't even understand it. We don't understand it.
So, I mean, the first thing both of you mentioned is that like the separation of idea from praxis is what I heard. I mean, of course, possession of skill, necessity to make art. Something interesting I read about Sol LeWitt, my knowledge on him is very limited, but that a lot of his artwork he never made, but he wrote down what to do and how to draw it. And so like, how did that work, and what qualifies as his art is my question.
So Sol LeWitt, very, very interesting human, because really what you're asking is, at that time, imagine the 60s, really groundbreaking for an artist to not make their own work. Forget even getting other people to make the work. He didn't even he wasn't like running a studio, whereas a lot of artists before him, they used to not make their own work, but they all kind of directed the artwork in a certain sense. Sol LeWitt, for the first time, he wrote manuscripts, right? He gave, essentially, was a guidebook on how to make good art or how to make art. And he did not, like, anyone could buy these books, collectors bought these books, and anyone. But if you read the manuscript, it's super interesting, because unless you are a trained artist, you will not be able to interpret what the manuscript says. So it's very, very, so I saw a retrospective by him in Mass Mocha, which is about 4 hours from Boston. It has one of the largest collections of Sol LeWitt work. And if you've seen the aesthetic of Sol LeWitt, it's really restrained. It's big, bold colors. It's very minimal at the same time. But some of his manuscripts would say, take a line upward, bring it back down, take it diagonally, and then take it horizontally. So if someone read that, to interpret that, first you can also interpret it in your own way. Second, it can also be interpreted in different ways. So I found it really interesting on the visuals they showed, and I also asked the person who was guiding us through this exhibition is, how do you decide which one was actually Sol LeWitt and which one was not what he wanted? And they were like, there is no really benchmark. And this is also just from a side point, where the art market starts to play a role, because the works are not sold, they're still sold as Sol LeWitt's works, but his manuscripts actually hold a lot more value in terms of monetary value than his artworks ever will.
This is the question that, you know, we were asked to write really lengthy essays about. Is the manuscript the work of art, or is the painting the work of art? Which is where it gets very interesting, because the ideas of, like, the tangible ideas of art, like ownership, authorship, credit, sale, money, all of the things that like add, very physical value to art. What do you associate that with? Do you associate that with just a set of instructions? Do you associate that with a colorful piece of painting on a gallery, or both? Or so if you associate it with both, then who gets, like, to put it simply, who gets the money? Who gets the credit? These questions still bug me, because I don't know. There is no correct answer to this. How do copyrights work? Very, practically, who legally owns this particular piece is also very interesting, and is a question that only conceptual art has been able to, and after that maybe street art has been able to bring up.
So interesting that you bring up the subject of ownership, Because the first time I came across Sol LeWitt and, well, what his artwork is when Trishla talked about it. But the second time I actually read about it was when I was doing the second meme video, like, does anyone own a meme? Plug, 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 check it out. So in that, the reason I mentioned that is because often the art of rebellion, it gets commodified and put in a museum, and then a price tag is put on it. But interestingly, Sol LeWitt's work, since everybody's unsure what the work exactly is, because it's abstract to the point of that it's an idea written down in a book, open to interpretation in some places. So is it a common trend in conceptual art, like across artists, to fight the idea of ownership and copyright?
In a certain sense, yes. I say that because I feel like I've seen a spectrum of artists across the globe. And I think innately, in a lot of ways, the artist community reacts to maybe a right-wing or a capitalist system in the way that they create the art. So they attempt at kind of pushing back. The thing is, when it gets popular, when it gets mainstream in a certain way, when it's liked by people, it gets incorporated. I'll say it in Marathi. It's a kind of gheuntak. It gets incorporated into a system which is not what it was built for. It was rebelling against it. And similar to also how Hinduism was like, oh, Buddha was a rebellion, we'll take him as the 11th avatar within Hinduism. So it's a kind of gheuntak understanding. Sorry, I don't know how to explain gheuntak, but incorporated is probably the closest understanding of it. I saw it, I've seen trends of this also happening, like with Rangrupa, which is a huge collective, not huge, but a big collective out of Indonesia. Completely kind of decentralized model of making art. They use found object, they don't buy art materials. In a certain sense, they don't even create physical objects anymore. And this is happening in the last, I would say, 2 decades, right? There are 20 artists. It's Indonesia, so social, political, economical context which they work in. They were like, no, we don't have enough money to buy these huge canvases things. Can we use found object or screen printing or kind of hacking the system in a certain way to create what we want? Today, Rangrupa is known as a huge body or collective of artists. Their work is very in demand. They're the curators for Documenta next year, 2020. Which is fantastic because they're Asian. They change the parameters of who gets to be shown in these kind of big global art fairs, art festivals. So here what I'm trying to say, so we had an Indonesian artist at Tifa in 2016, and he, Aditya was his name, he essentially created experience where he invited 10 people at a time into a black room, and he works with sound, so he had musical compositions of his own, but he got different DJs to mix it in their own way, and he got like street Ganpati, like street DJs to mix this, and he invited people in for 10 minutes and then he kind of threw them out. But the fact that you could party for 10 minutes in a room in broad daylight was his art. So I was like, wait, how can this be art? Like, how does this even work? So I think these are ways in which they're really seeing kind of ways of conceptual art and how it's panning out even to this day, where I find it super exciting. So going back to your question, it is always rebelling the system, but as it gets more sexy, it gets incorporated, which is sad, but it's also good because then there is a kind of ripple effect to it. Today, a lot of the conceptual art that we speak about right now, Marcel Duchamp, Yoko Ono, Sol LeWitt, the whole spectrum of them, they're all collected by museums, the best collectors in the world, because the world is really, really expensive now. And this is where art and art movements play a huge role because they respond to your current time. So it's a way of documenting history, which is why they're keeping it, which is why they have monetary value as well.
I find this very interesting because it's very less often that the artist gets to decide whether or not he or she becomes popular or sexy. That is like, it's not, I feel like that reaction does not, I don't want to say they don't have the power to do so, because they do, but like it comes from a very different space. It comes from a space of, like, say for example, if Rangrupa is going to Documenta is giving that to Rangrupa. Like, you understand there's still a power dynamic over there, and we tend to forget that when we talk about whether or not artists agree with the way the higher power represents what they have done. Because at the end of the day, how do you monetize or credit ideas?
But I like to add here. So there are artists also globally who've rebelled this. So they're like, you know what, hell with you, we're not going to participate in so and so because we do not agree with the ethics and the parameters in which you are situating this festival or this museum or whatever, or even the sponsorship that they get. So talking about an Indian artist, Amar Kanwar, who was selected for Venice Biennale, actually declined the offer to show at Venice Biennale. Venice Biennale is one of the largest, longest running biennales in the world. And I think 2 editions ago, he denied to go because he did not agree with where the funding for the Biennale was coming from at that point. So that is also a very harsh stand to take, because the romantic idea of a starving artist, it's not maybe so romantic anymore, but they do still come from a socio-economic background that might not be the elite. So I think it's really important to analyze also that rebellion that doesn't get noticed very often because they said no. We realize only the yeses and never the nos.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that actually. So Tate Modern has a turbine room, has a turbine hall, and there's this rule, which, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere. If someone gifts something to the turbine hall, the Tate has to keep it for a certain amount of time. They cannot reject it. It's there, so it needs to be there for some time. So a while ago, Tate was being funded by Big Oil somewhere, and there was this person, I don't remember their name, maybe they are anonymous. Do you know the person who...
The petroleum company?
Not the petroleum company, but the person who got this giant windmill wing and put it in the turbine hall? I don't remember the person's name. But like, for me, that is conceptual art, is when I disagree with you to a point where I'm going to go and procure steel, I don't know what, but get a giant windmill wing and put it in the biggest room in one of the biggest modern art spaces in the world, just as a point of rebellion. And also to that, coming back to my last point, is that how do you monetize something like that? Like how do you credit something like that? Or because it comes from, so how do you monetize an idea? How do you monetize an emotion? How do you monetize a rebellion? These are very difficult but important questions to art as a viewer when you are in a space and you're like, oh, I don't understand this. You need to sort of...
But also who monetizes?
That is also quite true. Who monetizes it? Like, who has put this here? So whenever you're in a space thinking, यार मैं इसको क्यों देख रहा हूँ? You know, मैं एक सफ़ेद वॉल को क्यों देख रहा हूँ? मैं किसी को चिल्लाते हुए क्यों देख रहा हूँ? Like, when you think about those things, think about what is your perception of what you need to pay for. Your issue with this is that you have had to pay whatever, 100 rupees, 50 rupees to come in a space and look at this, look at someone screaming, or look at a blank wall. And at the end of the day, what these guys are trying to do is make you ask yourself that this is the most bare form of idea. How do you pay for it? But I need to pay for it because at the end of the day, I get my food from it. So it's a very tricky question. And I still feel like I struggle with it a lot, but it's an important question that I feel like was born from the idea of conceptual art.
Well, if we're questioning how do you monetize rebellion, it's easy. It's pop punk. Well, I can't hate on it. I love it, actually. I'm in love with Green Day is my favorite band.
I don't know. I've had a phase.
I think we've all had a phase.
But jokes aside, the next issue I had in mind that I wanted to discuss is the issue of originality. And this is coming from a layman's perspective because I talked to a lot of people who are outside the art world before I framed questions for this podcast. I told them about a very specific artwork by Ian Byrne. Yeah, I think it's called Copybook or Xerox Book One. Yeah, you already know about it. That's great. So what he basically did is that he took a blank paper and he Xeroxed it 100 times. And by the 100th page, the noise of the Xerox machine was recorded in the very picture. And I told them as to why I think it's art, but they were like, but why would I pay for that? Why would I pay to see that? Why does that need to be recorded in history? So how is that original, most importantly? So what is your answer to the question that what defines originality in art?
Very interesting question. I'm very amused also by it because for me, I don't think there's anything as original anymore. We've been through way too many iterations. And especially in this day and age where you have access to the internet, every idea of yours has been digested through you, which is why you might think it's original, but there's really nothing as original anymore unless you're going super duper deep into a certain thing, which I feel like in general a larger public is not. So unless you're super specialized in, I don't know, machine learning or AI or whatever it is, there's only a certain amount of iterations that can be done of a certain thing. Also at the same time, we've seen parallels globally on one artist in India making something and the same thing happening at the exact same time in Beijing, in, I don't know, Uruguay or wherever. And these are people who are not in touch with each other at all. And it also has nothing to do with art. This can be ideas that are generated. It's like a collective consciousness in a way. And today, because we live in such a hyper-connected world, the collective consciousness is streaming in a much more, I don't know, fast-flowing way. A lot of ideas are dissipating super fast. Content is something which is very freely available today to a lot of people. So a human mind has a certain kind of way that it flows through things. I really like your example of the Xerox copy, and I think there are different ways in which that's happening. So you spoke about the Xerox copy, which is probably a work that happened about 40, 50 years ago, easily, more maybe. There are versions of that coming out from the digital spectrum as well. So we had an artist actually at the 2018 residency at Tifa called Artel, which was on to participate in the archive. And one of the artists took the group picture from the residency and took a similar screenshotting of it from Instagram and posted each till it kind of completely blurred away the image. So these are also to show industrial impacts or digitization impacts on image, on quality, on originality for that matter. And I think meme culture, again, going back to it, is a fantastic example to see you can't have originality. And the original thought is even putting two and two together. And I think that's where things get exciting, because if you take something, and this is where for me it's super duper important, is because we are in a multidisciplinary world. We're heading more and more into a multidisciplinary practice. But if a law student can make memes, if a psychologist can dance, these are things where it's getting exciting, because you're taking two almost polar opposite theories or nuances and applying it. And that's what actually conceptual art or contemporary art in a lot of ways talks about. It is not referenced. It's not researched. These artists do a huge amount of research before they put out what they put out. It's not like, oh, I thought of making this XYZ thing, or I thought of using this color of blue or this blackest black because I dreamt of it one morning. They've really worked on it. They're almost obsessive people, so they constantly come back to certain concepts that they're working on, certain questions that they're asking. Like an artist who's one of my favorites, Olafur Eliasson, works with light. And he's been working for light not just for the last 3 years. James Turrell has been working for light for decades now. He's spent his whole life's money on building an art installation essentially in a crater of a volcano that he bought. Now, these are not things that a museum is funding anymore. These are artists funding themselves because they believe so obsessively about what they want to do that they're doing just focusing on light to create illusion. Now you would think that this is a very simple thing, but they go into psychology of it, they go into philosophy of it, they go into color theory, they go into effects it has on people's psychology. So it's not impulsive reactions. Even Marcel Duchamp, it wasn't an impulsive reaction to put a urinal on a pedestal. It was a very thought out, a very researched thing, that this is a representation of our time. A urinal today has become something of this important of an idea that it needs to be represented in a certain way, also to question current reality. So in art, running a contemporary art foundation, I think a lot of people were also like, why do you do what you do? And well, because it discusses and pushes culture to think about itself. It's essentially a mirror for current humanity to question itself, and there are very few fields which do that in a certain sense. Also, immediate gratification for me is one thing that I really wanted to say at this point, because conceptual art, contemporary art, a lot of these things memes also for that matter, don't immediately tell you what they're trying to say. If you look at art before that, I mean, even if you look at Impressionism were just about started, but if you look at Renaissance, she disagrees with me, we've had this debate before. But if you look at kind of perspective drawings, if you look at the Renaissance, a lot, it does have bases in science, but a lot of it will give you the context. Even classical music, they say, classical dance, they say, it gives you the context. It tells you there's a deer, it's interpretive dance. It gives you everything. Conceptual art, contemporary art is taking away everything and letting you decide what you think of it. So actually you have to do your research a lot more to be able to read into that art, which is where it gets tricky, where like people don't understand it. But if you understand current politics, if you know your history, if you know your philosophies, you'll be able to make sense of it, because you'll immediately be able to draw a lot more references from it.
Yeah, going back to art history, I feel like we give less credit because it is an immediate gratification now, but it wasn't when it came out. For us to discuss conceptual art right now, we needed to have Impressionism. If there were no Impressionism, we wouldn't have conceptual, which is why it is so important to understand it in that context. Going back to your question, there's this really interesting sentence that someone I worked with told me, was that everything apart from your emotions is borrowed. Ideas, opinions, everything, like intellect, everything is borrowed. You are not in isolation. No one is in isolation, right? So how do you define originality in that sense? And second important thing that this person brought up was that does art need to be original for it to be art? Think about it, like most of these really famous paintings through art history, which people pay a lot of money to go to museums and admire, are they really original per se? No, they're inspired by scripture. They're inspired, like it's all inspired at the end of the day. So what is your baseline of originality? And like you have to ask yourself that. And when you ask yourself that, you kind of think about, why do I need this to appreciate something? Why do I need originality to sort of, when Van Gogh made the Starry Nights, that was absolutely original. But at the end of the day, he sat in front of like a landscape somewhere and drew it. So is it really original? Is something that you need to ask yourself to understand if originality is important.
So I think that's a great example. And I think she used the word imagination, which really excites me, because I think this is where the beauty lies. And this is where not just artists, but I think innovative thinkers, creative people have the power of imagination, or the capability of imagining. And because they're able to imagine, they're also able to imagine their own utopias, imagine futures, which is why they're able to create it. So unless you can imagine it, you won't create it, which is where it goes back to art. And
I mean, I just had 2 points of input on this one. Even with emotions, like at least the way I've read about it, is that the experience of emotions that you have is original in the sense. I'm sorry?
No, I was saying placebo.
No, the experience of emotions you have is also borrowed.
Yes.
In the sense that like it comes from an evolutionary perspective where you need it to survive, and another one is that there's a certain amount of cognition that is involved in it to understand it. So technically nothing is
original.
Yeah, so go ahead.
So this is what I wanted to say. So it's not really about originality and idea, but this is where I think artists really play an important role. It's originality in process. So they'll take the same idea, but they'll present it back to you in such a new format that it changes your perspective about how you knew it. So maybe like Kusama, Yayoi Kusama, who's a really famous Japanese artist, who essentially works with light and dots, and she's obsessive about dots, and she creates something called infinity rooms. Here she's really taken the symbol of a dot and created these small 8x8 installations, but they look like infinity. And here she's taken a simple idea and presented back to you dots, right? And she's done dots in literally in 100 bajillion ways that you could ever imagine that dots could be done. So she's taken a very simple process. There was a point where she took a completely white room. I saw it at the National Gallery in Singapore as part of a children's biennale, right? Completely white room. It has furniture that's white, the flooring is white, the cupboards are white, the couch is white, everything is white. And as you enter as an audience member, you're given a packet of colorful stickers. And you as an audience member are essentially doing her work for her in a certain sense, where you're putting these colorful dots all across the room, and you see a completely white room growing into completely like crazy colorful because you have created the art. So she's really changed as who makes the art, yet it is kind of her ownership in a sense of it. But the process is what is original in a certain sense, not the dot.
Yeah, so I find this very interesting, and I also find it interesting that we've only mentioned visual arts up until now. I want to like really give a shout out to a very important concept art work from music, which is called Symphony 4 minute 33 seconds, which is literally someone coming in, setting up, and then not playing anything for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So it's a blank symphony, which is by some people thought to be the birthing place of the white canvas movement. So the white canvas movement is basically, I think it's quite self-explanatory. It's you leave a canvas blank. So the idea of, hey, I worked this hard, but I don't like any of it, so I'm going to be quiet. It's very interesting, and it's not something that is just visual, which is what I feel like, guys, I think everyone should check it out. Everyone should check out and like show it to your friends, because it frustrates them, and I find that really amusing. So
I think even Marina Abramovich, in the way that she just sits, right? She stares into your soul like, what? Why? And that is the conceptual art that we're seeing today. And I think not just today, it's been happening for the last 4 decades probably.
So there's two places I wanted to go with this, but like followed by a comment. There's something that I recommend our audience checks out. It's been mentioned in another video. It's something called Everything is a Remix. It's a series of just deconstructing how most of pop culture is actually influence of an influence of an influence. So we'll start on the easier one, and then we'll go to the second one, which is a little more detailed. The first one is a place where I wanted to go. Like you said, there was this person who was letting the people make the dots and like draw something colorful, and the process was original. Now here, I wanted to take an avenue into generative art, and whether if it is inside conceptual art at all, and if it is, then to what extent is human autonomy important for art to exist?
She's so excited.
I would like to tell our viewers that Aditi just like celebrated. Jo Cheetah wo Sikandar was playing in the background. It was brilliant.
I don't think you need human beings to make art.
Yeah.
I really don't. Again, another shout out, if you have Netflix, you should check out this series called Love, Death, Robots. In the series, you should check out this episode called Zima Blue. It is one of my, it kind of will explain briefly in some way what I'm going to try and tell you, is that I feel like the concept of what art is has been heavily defined by who makes it, which I honestly feel is bullshit. I genuinely think.
Fully.
I mean, to some extent, I get it, but like, okay, think about it in this sense. How do I explain this in a way that I don't sound like someone who's just rambling? Think about it in this way. Anuj, I want to ask you, if you think of a meme and say, for example, an AI makes that meme for you, would it be your meme or the AI's meme? Second question, if the AI picks up on your thought, works on it, and makes new memes out of the first meme it made for you, are the rest of the memes your memes or the AI's memes? And the last question is, does the memeness of the meme stay intact when the AI makes it, or is it no longer a meme?
So the way I think of memes is because like I have thought about this question for about I think 2 years. Is that a meme is recognized? It's made in the sense that there's an ether where it comes from to in a cultural sense, but it's recognized. It's always been there. So me and the AI are just tool of recognition, is how I see it. But if you're saying that art is the same way, then like that's a serious mindfuck. I'd like to think about that for a while.
Yeah, I mean, please think about it, because I find it really frustrating when we separate popular visual culture from art. Meme is a fucking art.
Yeah, sure.
Like, why do we need to separate it? It's all the same, right? It's visual culture at the end of the day.
So, I mean, this is literally my claim to fame. Is because if memes are not art, then like technically I'm a fraud.
I mean, there's a whole. So I don't know if you know this about Anuj, but Anuj was a curator while he was doing his internship at Tifa, and he curated an entire meme exhibition, a whole series that actually traveled to 6 cities, which is pretty phenomenal. 8 cities. No, 6.
Venues.
8 venues, 6 cities. And it's really to think about how art is not separate for visual culture. It's actually a response to it, a pushing of it, creating also frictions between these different visual cultures that exist today. AI art, generative art, yes, and it's not new. It's been happening for a very long time. Memes, algorithm-based, different visual culture, things that have been happening for a very long time. I do, in a certain sense, still hold a lot of space for artists that do use tactile experience, use material, because that is a whole different kind of thinking, which actually on a digital realm will not be possible after a certain point, because that's something that you can't build. You can't build tactile experiences yet it's coming. And I've seen like some fantastic textile based art and different tactile generative 3D art that's coming out. Yet at this point, I don't think there's enough of it. We are doing a festival called Siberia, which is all along the lines of VR, AR, AI, algorithms. We're doing something called an algo rave, which is algorithmic music and live visuals that come from it. So yes, there is a huge sense of originality, but you have to go back into who created these algorithms, who is the source of that. So even though it could be generative today, it's not always generative, and innate biases of who is creating these, and also responses from the larger society. And because the society is biased, those are reflected within the algorithms that we see. So I do see a huge need for humans, whether that's from initiatives that we see like Computer Girls, which was a show at La Gaîté Lyrique in France, or whether you see Girls Who Code and different code camps for women, code camps for more inclusive communities, code camps for low-income communities. I think these become really important forums where humans need to now actively place themselves within the generative realm to make sure that the issues, socio-political, cultural issues that we have today are not repeated or even amplified in the future. So I do hold and reserve space for humanity and human intervention within generative art going forward. Plug in for Gene Kogan, you must check out his work. He makes memes, but he also makes AI-based generative art. So if you look up his work, you'll kind of see also his papers. His papers are fantastic.
Yeah, there's no hope in humanity. I look at it from the perspective of a point where the idea of generative art or of generative creation in general is fully formed. Not now, like centuries from now maybe. Then who is your bloody audience? Is the audience necessary? I'm sorry, I can see like both of their faces twitching a little bit. But like, who is your audience? And is the human being the audience? Is the art generated for the human being? Does the human being generate art? Like, these questions I feel like are very interesting because we look at it from the perspective of now, but when we look at it from the perspective of something that is fully formed, what is tactile to us may not be tactile to an entity, a bot, right? Then how do you define tactile, right? And then it changes from, I would like to say, species, like from species to species, which is what makes this interesting. The bottom line is, does it not make it art? I think it still makes it art. Like, I look at it from the perspective of, if this is really cool question that, again, I keep thinking about, because I think about weird things sometimes, is that when, say for example, there's this really cool philosophy called space is a practiced place. Space does not become unless you practice a place. Like, unless I'm practicing this place, it does not become a space, right? So now think about it from the perspective of a video game, for example. Will the video game, if you don't practice the video game, in its state of stagnancy, is it still a video game?
That's an interesting question.
I mean, I don't know the answer to this question, but I think about it a lot. But I feel like these are the questions that come to me when I think about generative art or when I think about digital intervention in art. Is because these definitions that we know right now are formed very, at least for a layperson like me, are formed very loosely. A couple of generations from now, this will be probably fully formed. And then their definitions will be absolutely different from ours. So I feel like we need to give it time to sort of, yeah.
But my question to you is, what is your utopia? Where do you want it to go, not where it might go? Because if you, like, as I was saying, it's all imagined futures.
Yeah.
So where are you imagining, or where would you like it to go for it to still have some? Because for me, I believe as humanity, we're kind of going in this weird realm where it's definitely like cyborgish, but we're also going into a kind of back to the future format.
Yeah.
So you're seeing more and more people move away from urban environments, more and more people going into things like farming, things like textiles, because there is an innate need for humanity to work with tactile materials, to touch and feel, because that's how we inform ourselves, that's how knowledge is built. Yet at the same time, we're not functioning as normal human beings anymore. We have a lot of interventions, whether it's in terms of chips, whether it's in terms of devices we're using, in the ways that we're viewing reality. So reality is essentially skewed, whether now or in the future. But what is our utopic kind of balance? Because I feel like if we're not looking at humanity anymore, those become really ethical questions outside of art completely. Is where is this going to go, and in whose benefit is it, whether it's in not just humanity but species, or is the machine actually taking over, which could possibly happen. I mean, I see all inclinations of it, but for us to think about what would be ideal for you, for us.
So this is where my skepticism messes with my personality. Because as a person, I mean, you know this, I am extremely tactile as a human being. I need to write things down. I can't use my phone.
Discussing craft.
We're discussing craft, yes, and for me it's very important. Like, it's very important for me to look at a person when I'm speaking to them. It's very important for me, and I really do hope that is something that our great grandchildren will and can grow up with, if we have any. If we don't have any, then the reality that I'm thinking of is going to be so true, which is that we're going to be, the cyborg overlords are going to win. And yeah, that's where we're going.
Okay, listen, I see an opening and I cannot resist this joke, but okay, boomer.
We clarified.
Well, just a joke. The final question, which we have the least amount of time for, which is fine, we can just run over the clock. They'll have to deal with it. Is that a friend of mine and a fellow curator or a content creator? His Instagram is Ultra Arcade. Go check him out. He runs an aesthetic page. So what he does is he looks at different artists across the internet and he curates their aesthetic work into his Instagram profile. And the common question that he's getting from his friends and his audience is that, what does it mean? And if I don't understand what it definitely means, I am unfollowing. So his complaint is that too often the lack of clear meaning is what turns the audience away. Now, we discussed that whether audience is important for the creation and existence of art. I lean towards no, but at the same time, they're the ones who sustain the art practice. So, is it possible at all that because conceptual art demands so much mental space in finding meaning, that it turns away a lot of audience, or is that just me being a snob?
No, it's not you being a snob at all. It is very specific or systematic that it is doing this abstraction. The artist is very aware that they are doing this abstraction. And with working with so many artists, I've also realized that a lot of this also comes from the West. A lot of the abstractation, a lot of the art history that Aditi and I both spoke about is very important to recognize that these are all formats, these are all histories set within Western contexts. So when you kind of copy-paste a lot of this, and internet culture is still relatively new within developing countries like India, like huge parts of China, Africa. We know the drill. But it's really to think about, how do these things apply to us? How are these things relevant to us? And how do we contextualize them for themselves? Now, if I bring a work by Joseph Beuys, who's a very famous contemporary artist, to India, people will be like, what the hell? People even there go, what the hell? But I think here it's just so far away from our reality, and there they would, at least if you see a couple of Joseph Beuys' work, you'll be able to understand, but it comes from a certain kind. It's like the difference between Hindi and English, or any language in English. Someone who doesn't speak English will always look up or aspire or think of it as a way of access. Visual art and conceptual art in a certain way is a lot about privilege and access. Where do you see these artworks? You see them at museums. How much do you pay to get into these museums? Where are these museums located? Indian museums, on the other hand, or other museums all over the world, there's a lot of, firstly, museum culture comes from a very post-colonial or colonial construct. Aditi can speak a lot more about this. So I think it's really important to identify which visual culture, or not just culture, it's coming from, and the history of that within the context it's shown in. And we work with a lot of artists to kind of contextualize it for here. So even if it's a German artist working in India, or Dutch artists working here, we push them, which is why the residencies become important, because they can then immerse themselves in understanding how can the ideas I'm talking about in an XYZ place apply to a certain narrative or a certain story, or how do I make it accessible. A certain amount of artists don't want to make it accessible. They don't care. It's for a certain kind of people. It will be for a certain kind of people. Yet at the same time, we're seeing a lot of contemporary artists, a lot of community-based practice now picking up. In the West for a little earlier on, but in India in the last decade, I would say, where it's really thinking about accessibility. How do we get artists who speak regional languages? How do we get creatives who work in multiple different spheres, spectrums? How do we talk about inclusivity, translations? Obviously, these are very laborious processes, all linked to funding, also the lack of funding within these countries and spectrums to talk about what they're saying. But to tie up your answer, I think to your question, it's essentially yes, they're very aware that they are being cryptic in a certain sense, and it's okay for them to be within their context, I would say. But if they are stepping out of their context, I do think that they need to reanalyze where they stand and what they mean. In India, we have a really famous artist collective called Rax Media Collective, who I would say are probably the only kind of conceptual artists in India. The others, I don't know what the line is for conceptual artists, but they would be more contemporary artists than conceptual artists, because they do still have a visual form, a visual narrative, a visual sense to what they do. Rax Media, I think, but if you read Rax Media Collective's papers, you'll know how sound their ideas are, how backed by science, by philosophy and literature the ideas are. So it's really to talk about conceptual art in that basic form. Do their works, can you put their works out in public and have everyone understand them? No. And I think they're well aware of it, but we'll see.
I feel like, firstly, going back to the idea of how the Indian audience deals with this, right? Is that and I'm speaking of this from the perspective of actual research, is that the idea of the arts in India have been very different from what we know now pre-colony. So the idea of the arts in India has been ritualistic, has been to some extent also conceptual, also utilitarian. So these oral, the process of segregating all of this came here from the West. And the process of elevating it and giving it this tangible value of money, of worth or whatever, came through colonization. And of course, because of the powers at play, we got the short end of the stick, right? So that is one thing, which means that for centuries now, for that matter, generations of Indians, or I guess a lot of people from a lot of colonized countries, have gone through this weird process of generations before them knowing something and them completely erasing it and knowing something new. So now we are at this place where we are aware of a lot of things because of the internet culture, because of what we know, but we don't know what to do with it. One is that. Second is, this exercise which I feel like I do when I'm when I enter an art space, or when I'm going to speak to an artist or whatever, leave every fucking thing behind. Like, don't go in with any expectation and try to understand what the experience is. Don't try to understand the art, just try to live it. I know that this sounds very like I'm some sort of spiritual person, which I'm not, but like genuinely try to do it, because when you have these levels of expectation, because you know a certain way in which art is supposed to be looked at or perceived or whatever. When you don't think about it and you just like enter a room, like, oh, okay, empty room, cool. Like, just do that once. And that makes stuff a lot more easier. You don't even need to you don't need to get what the empty room is supposed to stand for. Another important thing to keep in mind when you go into art spaces, if you want to go into art spaces, you do not need to understand it. You absolutely do not need to understand. I feel like people feel so much pressure and hence like refrain from going into art spaces because they feel the need to walk into that space and understand it. No, most of these places are made in a way that they intimidate you. And this is also coming from a space of research. There's something called a white cube. The white cube is designed to intimidate its viewer. So be aware of that. Don't let it intimidate you. Walk in, even if you don't know squat about it. Just walking, look at it. It's okay. Don't say stupid shit about it. Is all I'm gonna say. Save that till you leave, because you may be rude to some people. But like just like let it be. Don't try to. There's no compulsion for you to try and understand it. And I feel like once you do that, the concept of conceptual art becomes easier.
I think very well said. I'd like to iterate that further in being like we're working on being a non-white cubes case. We say we're not wine and cheese, but chai and vada pav, which is essentially like street food, local food. So it's kind of not being uppity. But I think the only reason we know people in the arts think they know so much about art is because we expose ourselves, and that's, I think, the key thing. The more you see, the more you know, not just in art, but I think anything, life. The more you can contextualize it, the more you can understand it, or even for yourself. And here, I think it goes back to your question is, why is it not understood? Also, I feel like there's a huge amount of laziness from younger people today, not to say younger people, even from us, even from an older generation, but largely from humanity who's now so used to immediate gratification. So we want to know everything, and I think this is with your friend's page as well. They want to know everything told to them in all of 5 words. But if you have to say it in 5 words, you have to abstract it. So I think they don't understand the kind of chicken and egg where you're going back. Cannot be immediate gratification anymore. You have to go deeper, you have to dig deeper, you have to ask the right questions if you want the right answers. And I don't think people are just willing to give things time anymore. Our concept of time has changed, which is why a lot of these repercussions happen. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, that's about at the 1 hour mark. And I hope that as audience this was big brain time for you, because it was big brain time for me. Thank you, Aditi and Trishla, for being on the podcast. And okay, kids, that's all I have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed Trishla and Aditi's opinions on conceptual art and their parallels with meme culture and their implications in philosophy and visual art. I'd like to do more episodes like this. I'm gonna try to get you more and more experts, more and more guests, try to bring you more content is my goal. But I'm gonna ask you to do a little bit of compromise for now. Try to get a good equipment and like a more stable place to record, but those things aren't really cheap. But thanks to my Patreon supporters, that's possible. Speaking of which, if you want to support this show on Patreon, you can do that by going to the link down in the description. I'm on Patreon as Deep Fried Neurons. And subscribe to me on YouTube right here, or if you're listening to this on Spotify or SoundCloud or one of those fancy audio places where you get podcasts like Google Podcasts and Apple Music or whatever, subscribe and stay tuned. So thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.